Hello, everybody. This is Robert Nicholson, president of the Philos Project. Welcome to the Deep Map, a weekly podcast from the Philos Project that explores the hidden religious and cultural dynamics driving headlines around the world. We're really excited about today's conversation. A couple of very interesting guests who I think will help us get a window into a side of the U.S.-Israel relationship that we hear a lot about, but don't understand very well, and that is the attitudes of American Christians about Israel and about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Motti Inbari and Kirill Bumin are two guys I've known for a couple of years now. We've discussed some of what they've recently published in a new book, and today we're going to unpack what the research says and hopefully get a better understanding and better context for the conflict that we're seeing play out. Motti and Kirill, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Motti, just quickly, I want to read both of your bios. Motti, you are a professor of Jewish studies at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. You've written a number of books on Jewish identity, on Jewish fundamentalism. That was actually the first place I encountered your work, Jewish fundamentalism in the Temple Mount. Kirill, you are currently the Associate Dean of the Metropolitan College, Director of the Summer Term at Boston University. Your work focuses on ethnic conflict, comparative judicial politics, and survey research on American public attitudes toward the conflict. I'm going to ask some general questions, and you guys can, take turns or chime in on any of them as you like. But I think that maybe the best place to start is with this new book, Christian Zionism in the 21st Century. Tell us about the book and what made you two, one of you being Jewish, one of you being Christian, two guys from two very different backgrounds, decide together to work on this kind of research.
Robert, actually, I would to correct you. We're both Jews. I'm from a family of Russian Jews that immigrated to the United States as refugees in the early 1990s. Actually, this January, I will spend. It would have been 30 years that I've been in the United States.
Wow. Okay. So, I stand. I'm sorry, Kirill. I don't think I've met another Jewish Kirill, so I guess maybe there's a lot out there I've never met.
Yeah, common Slavic, East Slavic name. So.
Yes. Sorry, go ahead. Same question, but new insights. Go ahead.
Yeah, so maybe I'll just jump in. And about 7 years ago, I started developing an interest in Christian Zionism, evangelical attitudes toward Israel, and we started talking with each other. And let's run a survey. Let's see what evangelicals think about Jews and Israel. And this is how the process started, step by step. And eventually, once we were able to complete one survey, and then we were able to complete another survey, we saw some interesting data in one survey. We wanted to run another survey to make sure, that we are seeing something correctly, and maybe there's interesting aspects that we have not viewed. So we eventually were able to put together 3 surveys and that are examining the attitudes of evangelicals toward Jews, Israel, the conflict, Muslims, and each survey kind of studies another aspect of this, a different aspect of this research. So the first survey was among the general evangelical population. The second survey was among evangelical pastors. And the third survey concentrated on evangelicals at the age of 18 to 29, because in our first survey, we saw something strange and unique, and that we wanted to explore even deeper regarding this age group.
And I want to ask you, Motti, in particular, because of my exposure to that previous book you've written, this topic of religious fundamentalism, or even zooming out a bit, religious belief and its effects on political process. How did you come to that? What about that topic was intriguing to you?
Yeah, so we are living in a world that argues that there is a separation of religion and politics, and that these two issues should be separated. But if you are observing clearly and deeply into our political world, you see that these two are not separated at all. And so we are living kind of in a denial that the separation exists, but it doesn't exist. And as a young scholar, as a PhD, I was intrigued about how it is manifested in Israel, in Judaism, and how Israel so supposedly separates Judaism from its identity as Israeli, and then I saw that it's much more complicated than just a simple argument of separation. Religious identities do influence political behavior in a very fundamental way.
You mentioned religious identities. Maybe if we could just frame your research for this book as you did in the introduction, could you give our audience a bit of a background on American public opinion towards Israel and the Puritans adopting Hebraic thought, and how did the founding of our nation kind of lead to and evolve in our overall public opinion?
Yeah, so maybe we need to take it to the Protestant Reformation as a point of beginning, as Christian identity started splitting and dividing. All kinds of old views have been reconsidered among Christians. And one of them had been also their attitudes toward Jews. So if we want to go that far, with the Reformation in Europe, there have been movements that re-examined their views regarding Jews. And this is where a new phenomena began among Christian Protestants. We typically we have the anti-Semite phenomena, that we know that this is the typical historical way in which Christians' attitudes toward Jews had been. But then we have the Philo-Semites, as this organization is actually called. The Philo-Semites is a view that developed mostly in Britain at the 18th century, and it migrated with the British people to the new continent and developed its very strong roots in America, in the American landscape.
Well, maybe for a lot of people listening, this is a new topic, and this is not something that they've followed very closely. They may know that some of what you just said, Motti, is true, that there's this kind of latent or not latent support for Israel that comes somehow from Christianity, certain trends within Christianity. Let me ask you more generally, and Kirill, maybe this one to you. What would you say is based on the research you've done, just what are the top line, insights that you found from your research before we start drilling down into any one of them? How would you explain to somebody, you meet off the street, somebody says, yeah, I've heard about Christians in Israel. And you say, wow, as a matter of fact, I just did a survey. Here are, the 5 things that you should know.
That's an excellent question. I would say that probably let me start by saying that it's difficult for me to compartmentalize the book from the more recent research that we have done that spans a number of religious denominations. We've looked at American Jews as well as Catholics. And so when I'm thinking about sort of the elevator spiel, I'm thinking about kind of reconciling things across groups. But in my comments right now, I'm going to focus on evangelical and born-again Christians. And I would say for me in particular, my familiarity with the movement was predominantly through the conventional media. And so my understanding of evangelical and born-again Christians was very caricatured. Pro-Trump, extremely conservative, slightly nuts, very, very religious. And very uniform in their perspective. And I think that when I walked away from that research, the original research that we did in 2017, 2018, the thing that really stood out to me was the diversity that we observed in this religious movement. Not only in terms of policy views or political positions or ideological positions, but also in the fundamental religious beliefs that characterize the evangelical and born-again movement. There's not that uniformity that we see in conventional media. Indeed, we see vast diversity. And from subsequent research, I've learned that the diversity that we observe is far greater than we observe in other religious movements.
So we can say that evangelical support for Israel is, of course, rooted in evangelical ideology. If it wasn't for evangelical ideology, it would have been, something very different. And evangelical ideology is going back hundreds of years into play. But there is a lot of misunderstanding what we have understood, and I continue what Kirill just said, misunderstanding of what is the evangelical ideology.
And what would you say, so Kirill, I think you just did a great job explaining some of the caricatures. It's monolithic, it's extremely conservative, extremely religious, even apocalyptic. What in your research, and I do hopefully want to get to some of the more recent research, but even for the book, what kinds of things have you found that would, maybe change people's perspective about what this community is and what it thinks?
So again, I think conventionally what we have seen discussed in the media and what is oftentimes quite poignantly stated is that evangelicals' relationship to Israel is driven predominantly, if not exclusively, by their political attitudes and their political views, their political conservatism. That's the position that they adopt. On the other hand, the religious scholars have focused exclusively on the religious components of evangelical support for Israel, finding only that religion matters. What we are able to do in our research is really consider all of the potential explanations together, and through sophisticated statistical modeling, we're able to tease out the unique aspects of each one of these explanations. And what we really found is that, yes, indeed, religion matters. Yes, indeed, politics matters. And socialization, kind of the environment in which people find themselves on a daily basis, matters greatly as well. And
tell me a little bit about eschatology, because this is always the thing that comes up. Certainly when I deal with, Jewish men and women, that what they have heard, which is usually very little, is that there is, a hope for Armageddon kind of buried in this, philo-Semitism. What have you found?
Well, let me start by saying that, my introduction to Christian eschatology was actually at the age of 10. Growing up in atheist Soviet Union, my family wasn't planning to be religious, but they wanted me to be educated. And so they introduced me to a number of religious texts, Quran, Torah, Bible, various Hindu texts, so on and so forth. I read them all. They were interesting, but the only thing that genuinely fascinated me was the revelations, right? The fire and the brimstone. It's a great story. I mean, it's a scary story, but it's a great story. And so I was fascinated by that. And then, I went and did something completely different and didn't my paths did not cross with that eschatology, with that study of end times, until 2017, when Motti and I started working on this project. And so that's when I started thinking about this again. And again, this is where evangelicals, from a scholarly perspective, are far more interesting as a religious movement than other religious movements, because there's variations, there's variability in how evangelicals perceive the end times. And so since the 1970s, and Motti can expand on this a bit more, we've heard predominantly about the version of eschatology that's called premillennialism. And for people who are not steeped in theology and eschatology, the essence of premillennialism is that it is a more pro-Israel type of understanding of the end times. The role of Israel, the role of Jews is elevated, and it's a view that's characterized by physical presence of Jesus Christ during the second coming on earth. Motti, do you want to briefly discuss the amillennialism and postmillennialism?
Yes. So I would say that maybe I just would take one step before that during the 1970s, bestsellers and the 1980s bestsellers, evangelical bestsellers like The Late Great Planet Earth or the Left Behind books, uh, kind of like they kind of curved the path in which people understood evangelicals' interest in Israel as through the apocalypse, meaning that Israel is a step toward the apocalypse and the second coming of Jesus, and therefore evangelical interest and support in Israel is based on the idea that Israel would eventually lead into the second coming, even without their knowledge, even without their interest. And this was kind of the way in which most people understood evangelical interest in Israel, which is it is a narrow view of what evangelicals believe. But okay, but it was very popular because the late great Planet Earth sold millions and millions of copies, so it was a very important text of that time of the 1970s, and we when we started our first research, our first survey, we came from the assumption that it's probably very, very big. I thought that it's probably something very big, and we wanted to measure it. So we asked multiple questions about the second coming, the conversion of the Jews, the third temple, and we were surprised with the results. They were not so high. What we did see that was actually high is this feeling of alliance, that there's Jews and Christians together, are sharing a culture, are sharing traditions together. This is something that really stood up as important and significant. And also that Jews are the chosen people, God's chosen people, which is, it's a surprise for people who don't understand Christian theology because they think Christianity is all about replacement. Yes, Jews were the chosen people, but then they were replaced. This is the Christian understanding. So it was surprising to see that in our surveys, that evangelicals think differently about those things. And premillennial eschatology is a belief that the second coming of Christ is an event that's going to happen in the near future. And certain events are going to happen before the second coming. Some of them include Jewish revival and Jewish renewal in Israel, rebuilding a state, rebuilding a nation, an army, and also rebuilding the temple. It's part of that vision. But this is not the only eschatology that exists among evangelicals, and this is something that we have learned in our surveys. There are other eschatologies. One of them is amillennial, meaning that there is no expectation of a grand second coming, and Jesus, from that perspective, controls the world from the skies. So the second coming that would happen eventually in the future will not be the moment in which he will ruin the world, but he's already doing it. This is amillennialism, and this is, by the way, common among the Roman Catholic Church. And there's also postmillennialism, which is a very optimistic vision about human progress and human ability to fix the world and make it a better place. And that after we will be able to fix everything and build the perfect world, then Jesus can come and rule the world. So these three eschatologies exist among evangelicals. And then we were surprised to realize that premillennial is not necessarily the only, and maybe not necessarily the largest even, eschatological vision.
I would love to zoom in a little bit with your work because, as you touched on, evangelicals aren't monolithic. They don't all think as one. And an outlier really is the 18 to 29-year-old group. When you control for that age range, they have very diverging beliefs from the previous generations who might have been described as more monolithic in their thinking or their attitudes towards Israel. So maybe we can even start with eschatology. What do 18 to 29-year-olds tend to believe, and how does that inform their views towards Israel? And then we can maybe dig into different demographics such as race and political affiliations.
So I would say that in terms of eschatology, we observe that the older generations in the evangelical and born-again movement tend to be about 60 to 70% premillennial in their eschatological views. Whereas 18 to 29-year-olds, under 30-year-olds, they tend to be more evenly split across three eschatological traditions with just a slight edge to premillennialism. I believe about 40-some% support premillennial view. About 20% or so are postmillennials, and the rest are amillennials. And what we also observed that was quite interesting is that, at least that's our guess. We don't have concrete and direct evidence of this, but this is our guess. We observed this also in our survey with evangelical pastors, that the older generation of pastors tends to be more racially uniform, meaning white, predominantly male, over 89%, I think, and predominantly premillennial, whereas the younger generation of pastors tend to be more diverse in their race and ethnicity, in their gender, as well as in their eschatological views. And so there's our hypothesis, and in some respects our hunch, is that the younger generations of evangelical and born-again Christians, they're picking up postmillennialism and amillennialism in these churches to which they gravitate from the perspective of finding more hip, quote unquote, more with the times type of pastors who look more like them, who act more like them, who see the world in a more modern, quote unquote, fashion. And so there is kind of a correlation that we see, that both the younger pastors and younger parishioners tend to be more diverse in their theological and eschatological views than the older generations.
Now, when you're asking that population in particular about their views on Israel, is eschatology or even maybe the Bible the most important thing for them? You mentioned earlier socialization. There's, of course, the news media. That demographic in particular, what are you finding inspires them or guides their views on the country?
Excellent question. Motti, do you want to start us off, or do you want me to take a stab?
Okay, if I'm already. So yes, we have conducted a survey among young evangelicals, and we actually asked them a question in relation to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Where do they place their support? And what we have seen is that I can't really remember exactly the numbers, but it was about 30% who said that they support Israel, about 40% said that they support neither, and the rest said that they support the Palestinians. So, and then the follow-up question was to type in an answer. Why did you choose the way you choose? And we have discovered very interesting insights from the way in which they responded. So those who said that they support Israel used mostly arguments that relate to the Abrahamic covenant, that God made a covenant with the Jewish people, and this is why they support Israel. So most of the arguments came from a biblical narrative. Those who said they support the Palestinians, basically we can divide their response into two parts. One used social justice arguments. Palestinians are victims of Israeli aggression. And the second half was very interesting. We received a lot of responses say, I don't know. So why do you support the Palestinians? I don't know. What does it mean? It means that it's in their gut feeling that they need to support the Palestinians, but they don't really have a clear answer why. It's a gut feeling.
And I actually, there's one slide I remember from one of the surveys you did that I've actually used now a number of times in teaching. And that is actually one of the slides in particular that I point to. It's fascinating. And I think it's so clever the way you guys had people write in their answers and then try to sort them afterward as opposed to giving them fixed choices. But the theories on that gut feeling of favorability, I think is what you called it. What is it? Social media? Is it friend group? Is it, media? Any guesses on that?
So actually, let me backtrack a little bit, because you asked about eschatology, right? And the degree to which evangelical and born again respondents actually understand eschatology. What we discovered both in our pastor survey and our rank and file surveys is that the understanding is quite thin, and even pastors rarely, relatively infrequently, speak about eschatological topics to their communities. But what happens is, through both the Bible readership and these random indirect discussions, many elements of eschatology are internalized. And so while the respondent may not directly associate their preference for Israel with a particular eschatological view, with a particular vision of end times, they sort of reach back into that bank of latent subconscious ideas. And so that sort of guttural reaction, right? I don't really know. It just feels like the right thing to say in this specific context. Oftentimes, eschatological views in particular are rooted in that deep subconscious and years of exposure to particular messaging, both through Bible readership as well as through participation in various groups. Other evangelicals talk about Israel, talk about the end times, or listening to the pastor talk about those subjects. What's particularly interesting is that neither religion nor politics nor socialization is the number one factor in explaining evangelical support for Israel. It's age. Okay? And so from the statistical perspective, what that tells us is we've already accounted for religious explanations. We've already accounted for socialization with like-minded people. We've already accounted for the fact that this person or that person is an ideological conservative, a voted Democrat in 2020 election. But beyond that, there's something else, specifically in the 18 to 29-year-old group, that makes them different from the older generations. What might that be? And Robert, I think you really hit it on the head. It's exceptionally difficult to measure this statistically, especially correctly. We tried to do it, we failed. But it's the informational environment. Our best hunch is that that is the biggest factor that separates the older generations from the younger generations, not only of evangelical and born-again Christians. This might be a broader American thing, because we observe somewhat similar trends in the Catholic surveys that we have conducted since. And so the grandparents and the parents of these young folks grew up in an information environment where propaganda ruled the day. U.S. had strong relationship with Israel during the Cold War. Information flow was tightly controlled by three major media sources. The types of messaging was very clear and coherent. Information sources were limited. And the stories, frankly, were very positive and very favorable to Jewish people in Israel. The memory of Holocaust was recent, so the world saw the atrocities, the horrors that the Jewish people went through. They saw the creation of the state of Israel. They saw Israel, this tiny little country, repelling multiple Arab invasions. Israelis, Jews, that were winning. They were engaging in building this beautiful kingdom out of a desert. Right? That's the imagery that characterized the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. And then the world became more nuanced. And the sources of information grew both in scope and in terms of their ideological, diversity, right? So the kinds of messaging that the younger folks saw during their formative years was a lot more nuanced and a lot more mixed. And the imagery of, Israeli tanks facing off against teenagers throwing stones, that's the kind of imagery that was much more common for the younger generation than it was for the older generation. It was an imagery that was less favorable to the Jewish people in Israel. And even though we cannot measure that directly, we've tried, but there's just not a really good measure for that. We do believe that that kind of informational environment plays a major overarching role in explaining these generational shifts that we observe.
And does that generational shift apply to American Jewish attitudes amongst the youth as well? Is the same phenomenon happening in the evangelical circle applied to the Jewish community in America?
Motti, you want to take that one?
So we actually just recently measured that, and we were surprised to see that among Jews we did not see those generational divides when it comes to the question of Israel. Although previous studies that have been conducted, some of them are Pew of 2020, did see a generational divide that is statistically significant. So maybe there is a mix of data, but the survey that we have conducted have not seen such a divide as strong as it is among evangelicals and Catholics.
Was that survey done after or before October 7th?
Before.
Before.
Yeah.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Was it March or May of 23?
May.
Yep.
Yeah, it was in May.
So is the idea there that this is me just throwing something out for you to respond to? For American Jews, this is not just some kind of issue that one cares about or doesn't care about. For many of them, if certainly not all, but many, there's a call it a familial connection, right? They're part of the story, therefore they care more. They're a little bit more impervious to these changes in the information environment.
I will take that one step further. I would say that sense of connectedness to Israel and the Jewish people and exposure to Jewish customs and traditions, working with Jews, praying with Jews, studying the Bible with the Jews, having Jewish neighbors, visiting Israel, all of these components of exposure to Jewish people and connectedness to Israel matter for the American Jews. They matter for evangelical and born-again Christians and for Catholics.
Yeah. So knowing someone and being in touch with someone from the other group creates and builds these positive feelings toward the other group.
And this is a very common finding in ethnic conflict literature, that when you engender that sense of knowledge and understanding of the quote unquote other, that you also engender greater sympathy towards the other. And so we definitely see that across the different samples, across the different ethno-religious groups, and those findings are robust, in light of a whole host of other explanations: political, religious, social, demographic, and so on.
I'm curious too. When you control for evangelicals, young evangelicals in that age range, does race within the United States shift favorability towards Israel?
We found one instance where race mattered, but its influence is pretty haphazard. So once we control for political, economic, social elements, race and other demographic elements just don't seem to matter. The only consistent one that matters again and again and again is age, right? It's that generational divide.
I want to add something. So we're talking about caricaturic view of evangelicals is that typically evangelicals are white. So sometimes they say white evangelicals, sometimes they say just evangelicals, assuming that everyone is white. But our studies repeatedly showed us that this is just not correct. Mm-hmm. True that there is a strong component of white evangelicals, between 60 to 65% of evangelicals are white, and the rest are not white. And there's a large African American evangelicals, about 25%, and there is about 10% Hispanics. And actually, in the demographical shifts are showing that then the non-white component of evangelical is going to grow even more to a place that it will be more likely to be a 50-50 kind of movement. And so the image that all evangelicals are white and just you need to study only white evangelicals and all kinds of strange things that we've been hearing is just the wrong misconceptions and stereotypes and caricatures of who is an evangelical.
But in and of itself, right, from a statistical perspective, there's no additional explanation that is to be had by looking at race. So once we consider all of these political, social, theological elements, race does not bring any additional story to this. So
So maybe I just emphasize that the white evangelical and the African American evangelical, Hispanic evangelicals tend to think in similar ways. So their race is not a factor that determines their views.
That's interesting, because I would have thought in 2020, when there was racial tensions here in the United States, that that critical theory or that maybe affinity for the Palestinians would have created an outlier for the Black American evangelical community. So that's a very interesting finding.
Yeah, we did find it in that survey that we have done, but it was from out of 4 surveys we saw it only one time. So we said maybe that specific survey have been maybe the exception, not the rule.
Not representative.
Indeed, what we did in our young evangelical survey, which is a part of the book, is and in many subsequent surveys, is we asked respondents about various social justice issues that are popular and important today. So we asked about support for BLM, specifically, Black Lives Matter movement. We asked about respondents' concerns about economic inequality in American society, about racial inequality in American society. We asked about how concerned they were about global warming and climate change. And we asked them about their concerns about anti-Semitism in the United States. And what we found is that among young evangelicals, global climate concerns, racial concerns, support for BLM, and concerns about income and wealth inequality form a coherent schema. So it's part of a coherent whole, which we call a social justice ethos, right? And so folks tend to, that express concerns along those dimensions, they tend to kind of think alike. What's really important to mention is that concerns about anti-Semitism do not fall into that schema of social justice. They're viewed separately. Young evangelicals are still concerned about anti-Semitism, but they conceive of that as completely separate and different from those other subjects. And what we see is that social justice concerns are, of course, quite prevalent and widely shared by many young evangelicals, not only white, not only Black. Indeed, it was a broad-based concern, and as we've discovered from the subsequent surveys, that's what also separates the younger evangelicals from their elders. They're far less concerned. 30-plus-year-olds are far less concerned about global climate change or racial or economic inequality, and certainly support for BLM is substantially lower among the older generations than among the younger generations.
So do those social justice feelings line up one way or the other for or against, affinity with Israel? Is there any big difference? One would think intuitively, the more you're on the, call it the intersectional side of things, the more critical you'd be of Israel, but maybe it doesn't line up that way.
It depends. So in a bivariate regression, when we only look at social justice concerns and support for Israel, yes, indeed, those that are social justice warriors tend to be less supportive of Israel. However, when we insert this variable, social justice ethos, social justice concerns, into a broader multivariate statistical analysis, it is statistically insignificant, meaning that whatever explanation there is in the data, it's already sucked up, right, owned by the other variables, by the other political, social, economic, religious factors that we included in the model.
I'm curious, did you guys control for the age range of 18 to 29 and college educated? Just thinking of the uptick of anti-Semitism on college campuses and critical theory being prevalent in college curriculums, I'm wondering if that's a factor in this worldview that's developing with critical theory of justice.
We didn't specifically look at the interaction effects. It's an interesting subject, but I can tell you that it becomes so technical that to present this to a layman reader would be exceptionally difficult. So we didn't look at the interaction effects of how an educated 18 to 29-year-old would think about support for Israel versus an educated, let's say, 65 and older year old will think about it. We didn't look at the intersection of those variables. But what we did find was that neither education nor income nor any other demographic variable proved to be statistically significant in a multivariate regression in any of our analyses and in any of the religious groups that we sampled. Descriptively, however, evangelicals and born-again Christian are on par with the average American in terms of their levels of educational attainment. The group that is by far the most educated that we've sampled so far is the Jewish population, where more than 50%, I think something like 60%, say that they have either a bachelor's degree or a graduate degree. Whereas the Catholics and evangelical and born-again Christians tend to cluster around some college group or bachelor's degree, or in case of evangelicals, some college and high school. Yeah, go ahead, Motti.
I want to raise another point of understanding what's happening with evangelicals and the attitude toward Israel. Is that, again, another caricature of evangelicals is that they are all going to church every Sunday and that they are all reading the Bible all the time, yes? And what we have discovered that basically you should look at evangelicals on a spectrum. It means that there are some that are go to church every Sunday and read the Bible and are very committed to their identity as Christians, and there are some that just don't go to church at all and never read the Bible, but somehow still identify as evangelical. And that's an interesting, it's an interesting question. Why do they identify as evangelicals if they never open the Bible and they never go to church? But still, they still identify as evangelicals. And we have seen a very strong correlation between going to church and reading the Bible and support for Israel. And so those who do that support Israel, and those who don't support Israel. We saw something similar also among Jews, Those who are more committed to Jewish identity also support Israel. Those who are not so committed to Jewish identity also not so supportive of Israel. So there is something with the core of the identity of these religious groups that drove them to support Israel. As you distance from the core, you also distance from the views toward Israel.
But there's a really fascinating thing that we're discovering. And again, when it comes to comparisons across all of the groups that we've sampled so far, we're just beginning to scratch that. That's going to be in the second book. And so actually this morning I was just putting together some data together. And so among evangelical and born-again Christians, over all of our surveys, over all of our analyses, we've repeatedly observed that religiosity is a major contributor to support for Israel, for evangelical and born-again Christians. And that manifests itself both, as Motti said, in frequency of church attendance, as well as in frequency of Bible readership. For Catholics, we find that it's completely insignificant factor in determining their support for Israel. They're predominantly moved by political and social considerations, not religious ones. Among Jews, we're finding something really strange in our preliminary analyses, which actually shows that more secular Jews manifest higher levels of support for Israel than incredibly religious Jews, which challenges the conventional wisdom. And so we're beginning to dig into that and really look, as Motti said, at the whole spectrum of church attendance and support for Israel rather than just the endpoints, right? Everyday attendees and a very, very strong support for Israel. And what we're discovering is that, again, there's so much nuance, there's so much diversity, and in some respects, all three groups align very clearly with one another. On other elements, they really are miles apart. With anti-Semitism, that seems to be a motivating factor for all three groups in our analyses in terms of what determines support for Israel. But when it comes to when it comes to religiosity, it really splits across groups in somewhat unpredictable ways.
That's really interesting. Very counterintuitive, some of that, what you just said. I I want to ask you here in the last part of our discussion more about let's call it the sociological aspect of your work, and in this particular moment. I guess first question is just about your own narrative arcs, if I can put it that way. Kirill, you hit this a bit. I guess you both have, about caricatures versus reality. Just anecdotal, curious, like what, I don't know, how would you describe your journeys down this rabbit hole? Getting to the microscope on Christianity and these different doctrines, and I'm sure you're rubbing up against evangelical Christians quite a bit, talking about these things. What would you say, just generally, about your experience in doing this research? What has it been like?
To me, it's been really fascinating. And again, the rabbit hole is the way I would describe it as well, or a ball of yarn. Once you pull, it just unfolds and unravels, and there's more and more and more. Also, I would say that, as you put it, Robert, we've had a chance to rub elbows with a number of leaders in the evangelical movements, theologians, with you, Robert, with Daryl Bach over at Dallas Theological Seminary, and others. And what I have discovered, again, which is very much in contrast to what you see in the conventional media, is genuine academic interest in trying to understand what is happening in the community. There is no politics involved. There is no agenda. There's just a genuine desire to understand who are the evangelicals, what do they really stand for today, and where is the movement headed. And that has been so refreshing to see that, we're not talking about indoctrination. We're not talking about, people that scream fire, brimstone, and none of that caricature stuff, right? Indeed, very thoughtful, very balanced, and very curious people that genuinely want to understand.
Yeah. I want to take it to a different side, which is the relationships of Jews and Christians. And so I have learned that the evangelicals that the research have taught me were different on what I thought they were to begin with. And the decline of premillennial eschatology is actually, I'm a little bit worried about that. Because it had created a surface in which Jews and Christians were able to find some bases together, that Christians wanted the well-being of Jews, and Christians wanted to support Jews. And it's actually, from the perspective of a Jew, I think it's good. I don't think it's bad. But seeing this declining and seeing the old ways rising up again is not a good sign from my perspective. And I hope that both the Jewish and the evangelical community will pay attention to that and try to, work together to make sure that good relationships between the two groups will remain also for the future.
Yeah, that really leads me to the other question I wanted to ask, which starts from the obvious point, which is that this research is not emerging in a vacuum. I mean, in some ways, you couldn't have picked a better time to publish this book, right? Questions about the future of Israel, future of U.S.-Israel relations. There's a lot to the point you just made, Motti. There's a lot to be concerned about, maybe, in what you've found. I'm curious, maybe just from both of you, how are you, I know you're academics, you're scholars, this is not the kind of question you're supposed to answer, but just as people, human beings who've been doing this, any other thoughts, positive or negative, about how you think what you've found relates to this current moment, and maybe what, all the rest of us out here should be thinking about going forward?
I'll let Kirill start. This is too big of a question. I need to think about
Big.
it.
So, what we did discover is that sense of community and frequent participation in that community, discussing issues of Israeli-Palestinian dispute with like-minded folks in your community is massively important. We found that effect in among American Jews, among Catholics, and among evangelicals. What it basically says is that when you have this strong, vibrant community in which you participate and in which you discuss issues that are related to interfaith dialogue, that goes a long way. From the perspective of strengthening that dialogue and strengthening that Christian support for Israel, what we've discovered repeatedly, and this is particularly true of both Christian communities that we've studied so far, Catholics and evangelical and born-again Christians, is that if one perceives that Israel is treating the Palestinian people fairly in the occupied territories, the likelihood that that respondent will express very high levels of support for Israel rises exponentially, right? So, from the perspective of the current conflict, what I think is really important for Christian pro-Israel Christian leaders to do is to lay out to their parishioners in what ways our Israeli actions today are just and necessary. And the more you help folks understand why specific actions are taken and how those actions are necessary, and what would be the alternative if it was, say, Russia rather than Israel that was engaging in militarized conflict, that could go a long way in producing goodwill.
Motti?
Yeah, it's a tough question to answer, and I would follow what Kirill have said, and I would just emphasize that Israel was brutally attacked on October 7th in ways that that are medieval, this kind of type of medieval kind of warfare. And I was really surprised to see some of the responses in the West and in the United States to this attack. And I believe that this cognitive dissonance eventually would create some changes in the way many Americans are looking at things, because this was really, the response was grotesque, just grotesque. And people will be able to see between the lines and party lines. Israel is not perfect, and Israel has done many things in the last few years that definitely deserve condemnation. But Jews have the right to have a land for themselves and have a homeland, and they should live. Everyone should live together in peace, and should pursue peace and try to find ways for peace in that territory. And I hope that our research would allow people to broaden their perspective of American subgroups and how they look at the questions of Israel and Judaism and the conflicts in the Middle East. And this is the first step, as we talked in this conversation today. This is the first step, and there are many more steps that are needed to be done, and we already started doing them in order to unpack Christianity and Christians in the United States, and what do they think about Jews, and what do they view in Israel when they're thinking about Israel. What's coming into their head. And we also want to see what Jews think about Christians, and it's going to be the other side of the coin in a much larger research about images of the two groups of one another.
Mm.
And I also want to briefly mention that our findings about young evangelicals, right, they raise more questions at this point than they provide answers. And for us, I think the million-dollar question is, what happens to these young folks who are under 30 right now? What happens to them in 10 years' time? in 15 and 20 years' time? Will they become like their grandparents and their parents, i.e. more supportive of Israel, right? That's what the so-called life cycle theory of public opinion suggests. Or was there something really peculiar during their formative teenage years that will make them permanently and forever, right, less supportive of Israel than their elders? And will they then communicate those less positive feelings to their children and grandchildren through the process of pre-adult socialization? And that's the million-dollar question. We just don't know yet, and we have to be patient for another 10 years to see how those trends change. But what we can unequivocally say when we compare our survey in 2018 and 2021 of evangelical and born-again Christians is that no matter how difficult it is to measure informational environment, it matters greatly. We conducted our July 21 survey after the Gaza conflict. There was a war in Gaza in May 21, and we specifically wanted to see if post-conflict, if there were changes in attitudes in the evangelical community. The rate of support for Israel, and this was for all age groups, dropped from 75% that we observed in 2018 to 50% after Gaza.
Wow.
So public opinion, even in the evangelical circles, which are inherently much more pro-Israel than just about any other group, short of American Jews, were still responsive to these changes in the informational environment.
It's fascinating.
No, it's very interesting. And I think, Kirill, you very astutely pointed out that this is the first, very overtly pro-Palestinian, anti-Zionist, even pro-terrorist organization generation. And so it'll take a generation or two to observe where those trends go.
Just one last word. That
yes, please.
When these young people grow and become parents and grandparents, they will have children and grandchildren. So there's always going to be a young evangelical. There's always going to be one.
Yeah.
הרופא הכי טוב הוא הזמן. I heard someone say once. Time is the best doctor.
I was going to say, Robert, you have to translate that for me. But, well, Motti, you mentioned that your next book is going to look at kind of the different sides. So what can we look forward to with your next book and future research, and where can we follow other work that you guys might produce?
For the next book, you'll have to wait because it's still not written. But if you're looking to learn more about our research, so first of all, I want to again remind our listeners that we have just published a book. It's called Christian Zionism in the 21st Century, American Evangelical Public Opinion on Israel. And it's available on Amazon and everywhere else. And it's even not so expensive compared to an academic book. And and you can look it up online. And when we will have another book written, we're sure gonna let you know, and we'll be happy to join your podcast again.
Please come back. You're gonna leave us hanging.
Give you a little bit of a preview.
Give us something.
Two big projects. One looks at interfaith dialogue and considers both how Americans feel towards Israelis, as well as harnesses the survey that we did in Israel with Israeli Jews about how they feel about American religious groups. The other project focuses on more comparative understanding of what factors influence support for Israel across different American religious groups, like Catholics, American Jews, evangelicals, and so on. So those are the two complementary but distinct projects that we're working on. We have a lot of data, but a lot to write.
Well, I will say this data that you guys have been producing has been not only fascinating, but practically useful for me as I talk to different Christian groups. As I said, I've actually used some of your materials in teaching before. I think the timing, as I mentioned, is extremely important. What you guys are doing, I'm sure sometimes it feels like you're kind of laboring off in some foreign land, but it's really, really important, and really want to commend you both. Again, the title of the book, Christian Zionism in the 21st Century, Oxford University Press. It is astonishingly, for an academic book, cheap. I'm seeing $29.95. That's amazing. You can check it out on Amazon. Motti, Kirill, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you both.